Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that extensive introduction. Today is a big day for me. Brazil will be playing shortly, so if I try to get through this quickly, you'll understand, right? And we're very pleased as the Women's Refugee Commission to be invited to take part in this discussion, this very important discussion on environmental sustainability in humanitarian settings. And it's a very critical issue for the safety and well-being of displaced communities, but particularly for women and girls. And I'll talk about some of our work that tries to address this. And we know that the greatest negative effects of our collective failure to address environmental concerns in the humanitarian settings actually falls on women and girls, especially in refugee camps where natural resources are often scarce, where they're often very scarce and access to them can be just life-threatening. But let me just say a couple of words about the Women's Refugee Commission. We are a research and advocacy organization, and with a few research and advocacy organizations working within the humanitarian sector. And our role really is to identify needs and gaps in the field. And we do this, and speaking to Anita's point, which I think is so important, it's almost more important to think about the way we do this work than the actual work we do. You know, it's the approach that's so important. And so what we do is we actually talk to those impacted by different issues. We talk to them about their needs, but we also discover through that approach some of the solutions, as Anita was mentioning. And that is absolutely critical when you're trying to deal with these sort of multi-sectoral approaches. People have many of the solutions at hand. It's a question of putting those resources in front of them. So here we are as an organization identifying gaps and needs and then trying to improve humanitarian practice so it is more responsive to the needs of women and girls in particular, but we also work on children more generally and youth. And we know from our experience that deforestation and environmental degradation are some of the most prominent, damaging and lasting impacts of a humanitarian response. And we also know that the simple act of cooking is one of the most significant environmental challenges today. More than 30% of the world's population relies on traditional biomass, primarily firewood, for their cooking and energy needs. In humanitarian settings, the vast majority of people have no choice but to use firewood. And so the drudgery and the burden of trying to find cooking fuel and household energy almost always falls on the shoulders of women and girls. And without safe access to natural resources nearby, they are forced to travel long distances to find sufficient firewood to cook their families' meals and to heat their homes. This means that every day millions of women and girls risk being raped, beaten, or killed just in this simple act of going outside, say, a camp to collect firewood. And to give you an example, the Physicians for Human Rights found that 91% of confirmed rape cases in the Fachana camp in eastern Chad occurred outside the camp when women were collecting firewood. This is a huge problem. It's just an unacceptable problem, and actually one that has a very simple solution. So in many cases, what we see are women walking miles, and as the camps grow and the degradation around the camp increases, women may be forced to walk 5 or 6 hours a day to collect enough fuel to put into to cook their rice and beans. As you know, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to cook rice and beans over a campfire, but it's a challenge. And so but the women are forced to consume a large amount of fuel to cook their food. We also know that when people flee, they often flee with just the clothes on their backs. They often have very few, if any, options for earning a living. Refugees are often banned from working, which forces them to rely on natural resources that require intensive labour in order to collect and sell firewood. This is maybe the only option that they have. And as a result, women and girls spend a lot of their time just collecting enough firewood to earn 50 cents in order to exchange that firewood to help support their families. So the lack of actual basic supplies, the actual basic resources for women and girls in a refugee setting immediately puts them at a very high risk, and a very high risk of gender-based violence. A Somali refugee woman in the Dadaab camp in Kenya told the Women's Refugee Commission that she could earn approximately 50 cents from collecting this bundle, but it took her as long as 5 hours just to collect that bundle of wood. And during this long, dangerous journey, she obviously was suffering not only attacks from armed militia, people in the neighborhood, but also exposed to dehydration from being in a desert climate. We've seen people that have suffered from scorpion attacks from just walking through a desert area looking for anything that they can burn. So in addition to selling firewood, some of the other common livelihood activities, such as burning and selling charcoal, cooking food to sell, brewing alcohol, and brickmaking, are all heavily reliant on natural resources, which has devastating effects, as we know, on the environment. And it's also important to realize that in humanitarian settings, firewood is often in direct competition with materials needed for the construction of shelter. In fact, UNEP has estimated that 30 to 40 trees are needed to build a single family shelter. The construction of a refugee camp can deplete the surrounding area's trees. The large concentrations of people living in crowded camps contributes to the rapid depletion of the land's carrying capacity in a number of ways. Their reliance on natural resources to survive not only has a negative impact on local ecosystems by undermining forest regeneration and agriculture, but also triggers tensions between refugees and host communities over dwindling resources. So already from just looking at this particular example, we can see that protection, livelihoods, energy, and the environment are linked. And it's not easy to separate them, which means the kinds of solutions, as we've already heard, that we're putting forward are also multi-sectoral or holistic solutions. And I'd like just to share with you very quickly some of the work we've been doing, which I think is a very good example of how you can tackle it from a number of different fronts. We've been working since 2007 to put cooking fuel and energy on the humanitarian agenda. And in 2007, we spearheaded the creation of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force on Safe Access to Fuel and Energy, also known as SAFE in humanitarian settings, and we co-chaired with UNHCR and the UN World Food Programme this particular committee. The task force produced the first ever guidance on providing safe access to energy in refugee settings. So we understand that the energy needs in humanitarian settings present complex social, development, and logistical challenges. And it goes beyond simply handing out a cook stove or planting a tree. Through a set of comprehensive activities that address the root causes of energy challenges in these contexts, the SAFE guidance that we've produced helps to protect both people and the environment. And because of the cross-cutting nature of energy use and access, SAFE seeks to combine clean and efficient technologies, alternative fuels, energy supplies, safe and sustainable livelihoods, protection interventions, and environmental activities. So it is a very comprehensive package. And just to share the sort of 3 key goals of this approach, the first is to ensure the safety and well-being of displaced people, especially women and girls, as I've mentioned before, by meeting their cooking and lighting needs. The second goal is to shift communities away from dangerous and destructive dependence on wood fuel and towards healthier and more sustainable options. And the third is to reduce the exposure and risk to gender-based violence and other threats faced, primarily by women and girls during firewood collection. We know that it's important to navigate the negative environmental impacts of camps from the earliest stages of response. Therefore, environmental management and rehabilitation projects, as we've heard, such as forest conservation and establishment of green belts in areas surrounding camps, are key components of the SAFE approach. And they're important for creating safe and sustainable energy sources for the population in need. We know that protecting the environment is critical, and communities need the capacity, tools, and resources to shift away from some of these harmful, risky practices that they are forced to undertake. And I want to close with just 3 points that sort of jump out to me when we're doing this work, and which I don't have been mentioned, but I don't think unpacked here. And the first one is that pushing forward in exploring these holistic approaches like SAFE, and testing and documenting new efforts to mainstream the environment require much more flexible funding. Finland is among one of the few countries that provides that flexible funding. And I want to note this because we've been trying to push out this SAFE approach for a while. And we're told very frequently that, okay, livelihoods belongs there and the environment belongs there. And I really do think that, Finland, if you took the lead in helping us really think through how we can get this more flexible funding for these holistic approaches, it would be a huge advance in this area. The second point is that doing this work, and Anita mentioned it, in doing this work, we need to work very, very closely with local communities and with civil society organizations. And some of that piece might involve building the capacity so that we do have advocates, local advocates for the environment. And this isn't an easy thing for us to get funded necessarily, because it's seen much more as development work as opposed to humanitarian action. And so again, I think that that's a piece that we really have to keep pushing and messaging on, because we've come up against a lot of trouble trying to push out some of these partnerships. And I don't think, to be quite critical of the humanitarian field, I don't think we've done a good job in building the kind of partnerships on the ground that we need to really mainstream environmental issues. And we are talking about new models, so it is new kinds of partnerships. And finally, I'd pick up on a point that was made by one of the panelists, and I think it was Rashid, on we need to build the evidence base. We don't have a good evidence base, and we know increasingly donors are looking for data that show that if you put clean cook stoves in a community, how does that impact, first, the environment? How does it impact the safety of women? And so we need to be looking at some of these projects, and so in part so that we can actually have that data that's so required to convince people to fund this work, but also to convince the humanitarian community that it's important. And those of us who work in the humanitarian community frequently hear, oh, no, that should be left to someone else. We're in an emergency. No, we're in an emergency, and if you don't put locks and lights and you don't look after the environment at the onset, you are going to have devastating impact both on the lives of the individuals you're serving, but also on the surrounding environment. So I do think we need that evidence base, and I do think that we need to start to think within the humanitarian community, if we're going to really mainstream the environment, we need to put on not just a protection lens, but it's almost a prevention lens. And this is a little bit sort of obscure and not something necessarily that the humanitarian community are used to hearing. We're trying to prevent degradation. We're trying to prevent deforestation. We're trying to prevent violence. And the kinds of indicators that we need to develop are different kinds of indicators. And people have to really try and understand that. So I think there's a lot of messaging and sort of PR work that needs to go on if we're really going to mainstream this issue. And I'll close there because we're going to have a discussion, but I'd like to thank UNEP in OCHA and the Environmental Unit for organising this event today. And thank you to my fellow panellists. I think we've got a lot of issues to address, and I think we've got a lot of practice and we've got to work together to really get this done. Thank you.
Yes, I'd also like to echo my thanks. I wish the panel was a couple hours longer, despite the Brazil game, because I think we could get to the bottom of having some concrete messages and making advocates out of all of you as well. But I'd like to open the floor. We have about a half an hour. Would you kindly introduce yourself when you take the floor? And then we'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions and put it to the panel. Anyone? Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting practical examples, and to Finland for hosting us, and to the Women's Refugee Commission. My name is Sibi Lawson-Marriott, and I work for UNICEF, and we were very happy to see this issue on the agenda because, as you mentioned, as a cross-cutting issue, it does sometimes fight for visibility with other issues that you mentioned, such as things like disability and gender. So we are glad to see that this work has been done. And we're going to be carrying back the issue very strongly because, of course, the groups that we're concerned with are the ones that are very directly impacted: children, their families, the women, and so on. We note very much the point that you're making about the links to accountability to affected populations, to looking for local solutions before we bring others, and to sustainable development. I think also young people, adolescents, they have capabilities that we can tap into, and more in UNICEF, we're forward-looking and seeing that this is going to be more of an issue and who's going to really be driving the solutions and forming the solutions. My questions are, I wonder if you could speak to some of the differences between actions we should take in urban context, which is something that's coming up more and more, as opposed to more rural, traditional context. And also, the team I work for in UNICEF, we review all the projects that come in globally for things like gender sensitivity and so on. And we're often asked for, since we have such different contexts, give us the 5 minimum things that you could look for. And I think you spoke about how you'll be looking at the environment as a quality indicator for response. As we try to sort of drive change internally, what kind of things can we tell our colleagues? You mentioned that we're going to have to all learn to look at things different, change things. Is that something we can do ourselves within, say, the UN and NGO family, agree on certain criteria that we should all look at as minimum standards? Do we look to an agency like the WWF to come in, look at what we do, how we do business, and advise? I mean, we have a willingness to change, but frankly, we're looking for what we can do. I'm sure that's the case for others as well.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Chaba Dumashie, and I'm from DG ECHO in the European Commission. And we're also very happy that this topic is on the agenda today, and because we're also looking into environment and environmental change and climate change and how that affects our operations, specifically through the resilience angle, and also DPECO and LRRD activities. But my question is exactly focused on that. So as you have all pointed out very rightly, that it is all about building back better, and the resilience and the protection lens, as Sarah has put it. I would like to know more about how you see the role of maybe governments and development actors in this, because as I see the executive summary focuses a lot on the UN, the humanitarian system, NGOs, and all our partners and the donors. But what I don't see is the development side of the equation. So if you could elaborate on that, thanks.
We'll start answering those very challenging questions, and then if you have more, we'll let you come back. So does anyone want to start with?
In terms of your question of, what are the 5 things and where to start, if I understand it right, the role that you and your colleagues are playing in terms of reviewing project proposals, gosh, that is a great opportunity. And if you could, I guess I've seen it done a couple of different ways, but just one thing that comes to mind, if that review committee or team or whoever they are could get some basic training in the fundamentals of what the environmental and humanitarian action issues are, and then work together as part of that process to determine what would be the criteria that's appropriate for your agency and the type of work that you do, and then streamline those guidelines and criteria into your funding application so that your folks are addressing that as they apply. But then we also have to be mindful of this flexible funding issue. And if you're requiring your applicants to address the environment, are you also going to support them to get the tools and techniques and training that they have in addressing that? And maybe that's where partnerships might be of some use. Also, the urban issue, also a tough one. We haven't quite figured that out in WWF. We tend to stay away from urban issues because that's where all the people are, and that's kind of scary for us. But we are now realizing, as I mentioned, we have to update our way of thinking around environment and conservation. So we are struggling with that. My team is working with the Red Cross in Haiti, a lot of urban issues there in Port-au-Prince. And so we're looking for how can we modify and adapt some of these approaches that we've used in rural areas for urban areas, and developing local partnerships with groups who are on the ground, who are Haitian, who know how to do that very well, and bring them into the process. And that also speaks to your question about the other actors, the local government and development actors, bringing them into that process. For us, we try as much as possible to focus on contextualization and what's happening at the local scene. We have guidelines, we have criteria, we have indicators, but you really have to make the work on the ground fit to the local context.
I'm just going to build upon what Anita said. One, on the urban issues, if we've seen in the current conflicts that we're dealing with, is also an access issue. And so we're seeing things like solid waste management in urban areas, for example, in Syria, which cuts across several different sectors. It's health, it's water and sanitation, it's also some of the early recovery responsibility. And so that's a challenge. I think the way the system is designed is to have the technical expertise in the different sectors, but then to clearly assign responsibility. I mean, the same issue with access to energy, after so many years of realizing this is something that we can't just give stoves and food without giving something to cook, the fuel to cook it. The same thing is we can't neglect the impact that solid waste management has on the humanitarian response as well. So it's something that we're looking at, clearly defining the responsibilities among the different clusters. I think an additional tool that we've been trying to promote in some context is similar to the gender marker, which is a facility to rate different programs and projects on how gender sensitive they are. We have developed, UNEP has developed in the country level in Sudan, has rolled it out also in South Sudan and Afghanistan, what's called an environment marker, which is also supposed to be a guide for humanitarian donors to see whether or not, if they want to put some funding along this criteria. Similarly, in common funding mechanisms, we would be able to use an allocation of against environment criteria.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. Actually, regarding this tools issue, as I said in the beginning of the panel, Finland is committed to financing the implementation of the study, and we really hope that the agencies who are working within the Interagency Standing Committee are going to think in terms of what would be the tools, the kind of criteria, etc. And we kind of see this report and this event as a start of the process. Then about the resilience issue, it's a very, very important issue, and if we think in terms, for instance, of mixed situations, etc., certainly you need both humanitarian development actors to work together, and also, there has to be an understanding, awareness by the community itself, who is, for instance, hosting refugees, etc., what this means, and the authorities, etc. So we must work much more closely together with the development community on these issues. Thank you. I don't know.
Yeah. Sarah. Oh, well, this one's also on. Yeah, I've got two microphones now. Just to add to the question about, sort of funding proposals, UN Women. I think one of the challenges in this area also is that these are projects that need long-term support if we're really being able to show results. We know that if we've got indicators looking at the environment, this isn't just an 18-month project. This requires longer funding. So I think that's something for you all to think a little bit about. Going to the sort of camp versus urban issue, it's particularly challenging. I mean, if you look at the Syrian crisis, this is a very new type of crisis for us because the majority of people are not in camps where their services are set up from scratch, where we can look at waste disposal more easily. We've got large numbers of refugees living in urban or peri-urban areas in Lebanon and in Jordan. And really, to be able to tackle it effectively, it is working with the local government and some of the local organizations and trying to identify services that we can help support, help scale up if necessary. It's a very, very different challenge. And I don't think we're quite there. We're struggling within the humanitarian field. But I do think, just looking at the Syrian crisis, it is an opportunity, if I may use that word, to actually think about the environment in a setting that is particularly challenging. And if we can get it right in that kind of setting, maybe we can get it right elsewhere. So I think it's worth really thinking about what we could do collectively to tackle that issue in the current crisis, which, quite honestly, if we don't do something very soon, is going to be catastrophic just for the sheer numbers of people that are residing in areas that have absolutely no facilities and services. So
I think we have time for a couple more questions or statements.
Thank you very much. My name is Andreas Hilmarsson. I'm with the Mission of Sweden here in New York. I hear your point about the importance of flexible funding, and I have one question in that regard, because I think you're absolutely right, and we're trying also within our government to try to be as flexible as possible in order to support the resilience and other issues that are often sort of being drowned into, not very easy to catch. So it's much easier to go on clusters or themes or organizations for that matter. But my question is, we're also big donors of core support to many of the UN organizations. And I'm wondering to what extent the organizations also take their responsibility to allocate the funds necessary to strengthen these aspects, because, as I said, a big chunk of our support to UN is actually non-tied, unearmarked resources. So we also would like to make sure that those funds are actually being allocated also to this area. Thank you.
Any other comments from the floor? Okay, I'll take that question. Do you want to say? Anyone want to answer that? It's us. Rashid?
Yeah. Oh. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. In response to your question, I have to say that what we are doing at the response stage, all the response actors, is something that we have not done earlier in preparedness or building resilience of the affected communities. Part of the response is addressing these issues that have been left unaddressed before. And I would like to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of the humanitarian organizations of the UN, of course, God forbid, but I would like to say that in the time when there are serious budgetary constraints of main donors, and these organizations are facing these constraints also in terms of resources that they are getting from donors, in terms of funding, it's very difficult to address the challenge that environment issues that we are discussing today are addressed properly on the humanitarian context. And of course, it is the responsibility of the UN agencies and its partners to address the issues that are related to response. But I would like to say maybe defending them also, they have many challenges. Too many challenges and too little resources. And I would like to say that Sweden, of course, is very generous, and its unearmarked resources are playing an important role in contributions of Sweden to UN agencies and its partners. But I would like to ask others also to be as generous as we can and as they can, and of course continue to make pressure on humanitarian agencies. This is probably the way out, two ways. Thank you.
Yes, if I could just comment on what Rashid said. I think we've heard examples of things that do require additional funding, but also things that can be done in terms of setting standards and changing the way we do our programming, which doesn't necessarily require additional funding, but just requires a certain change in the way we do our thinking and our assessments. And I think there's also funding to be found. There's new streams of funding coming from climate change. There's the environment dimension as well. How can we ensure there's a better integration of funding for environment, funding for development, and funding for humanitarian? And I think increasingly when we talk about flexible funding frameworks, it's that as well, as making sure these different funding streams are joined up. And when we work in the field in environmental emergencies, we find that sometimes ministries of environment aren't talking to the disaster management authorities. And so it's this type of work where we try to bring them together and ensure that those different dimensions are taken into account. I'd like to provide an opportunity for the panelists to say one last thing before our time is up. Does anyone have some final remarks?
I just want to thank you, Wendy, for your inspiration and your leadership on this issue. It's greatly appreciated from the NGO perspective and the government and my fellow panelists. It's been a delightful conversation, an important topic, and I look forward to your continuing to make progress in this area. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank all of you for participating today, and then of course our panelists, because I think we have, at least I have learned a lot today, and I have also realized that there are really already a lot of good practices there, and also policy and standards, but now we really have to begin to implement these issues, and we find in Finland that this report really, it contains good recommendations that can be easily implemented if there is the political will to do so. Of course, coming from a rather small donor country, we are going to work on this on the policy side, and we are going to discuss this with our good humanitarian donorship group colleagues on Thursday, and I hope that we'll get the kind of commitment and promise out of that meeting of ours on Thursday to be more vocal on these issues and really begin to push forward the agenda, because this is crucial about our lives as human beings, and really we have to be able to do much more than we have been able to do until now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending this meeting, and I would like to ask Anna and as well as everybody, two messages actually from the UN. One is to donors group that is meeting on Thursday, and the second message is for the same group that is meeting here. We will not get you out of the hook. Thank you.
I will. I promise we will.
I think I'll just close by saying I think we've got many of the tools. We've got a lot of the guidance and recommendations that we need. We have some very effective interventions that can be scaled up. And so we need to be putting those in the field. We need to be implementing and holding each other accountable for the effective implementation of these actions. And that's always hard, but I think it's very doable, and I'm quite positive I'm actually a very positive person, but I'm particularly positive on this count that we can get it done, because I'm seeing different agencies come together with a sort of common concern, and we're doing it at the right time. I think if we can get it done now, we can really have impact. So I'll close with that note.
Before you all leave, I have a little infomercial video to show you. But I wanted to say, again, we're available. I'd really love to hear from you. If any questions on follow-up, the idea is that we have partnerships. You're our partner now. You've now been seized of this agenda, and we need to build the evidence. Part of the way we hope to build the evidence and get our word out there is to recognize those individuals that are doing such great work, like Anita, so as a Green Star Award. So this is our little infomercial. We're launching a call for nominations today. Thanks. The winners get all expense paid trip to Oslo, Norway next June, and to attend the Environmental Emergencies Forum. Thank you. Thank you.